Well, hello, and welcome to a Canyon Professional Development session. This workshop session is titled, It's a Diverse World, Culturally Competent Teaching Practices. This session explains how culture influences instructional approaches in the teaching and learning processes. The presenter, myself, will provide tips and strategies for implementing effective teaching practices that can be used to incorporate culture in the classroom and create awareness of the impact of social and cultural factors in learning. So hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Hollis II. I am the Assistant Professor of Education at Grand Canyon University, the College of Education. Thank you so much for allowing me some of your time to present this very important information. I am also a doctoral candidate looking to complete my PhD in general psychology with an emphasis in cognition and instruction. In this session, we have three goals that we will to meet. We will explore diversity, talk about teaching and learning, and then lastly, we'll make sure that we're honoring culture. And I have it in quotation marks for a very specific reason, which I'll talk about throughout today's session. As part of exploring diversity, we'll discuss the ways in which society has evolved to become more diverse over time. As a part of teaching and learning, we will identify some of the current challenges that exist both in the classroom and out of the classroom. Then lastly, again, we will analyze throughout our session some effective practices for establishing and sustaining, which is important, an inclusive classroom. As a part of our session today, it's important to talk about our why. And our why for today's session is we want to tell you why we exist. And as a part of us existing, we want to make sure that you know our job is to empower you, to educate you, so that you can in turn do the same for others. The information from today, I hope that it is practical enough so that you can not only self-reflect the part of what's discussed, but you can use it as a part of practical implementation in whatever area or domain you see necessary. We have a variety of ways in which you can participate. You can participate by having open thinking and self-reflective thinking that may challenge some of your original thought. You can also feel free to take notes if you wish, and you can share your ideas or your experiences with others and make sure that you demonstrate empathy with what's shared. So just to get us started, again, my name is Nathan Hollis. This is my family photo from about 1980. And if you have a chance to look at this picture, you will see that there are many, many differences here. Some of the differences you may see in my older brother, Derek, who is choosing to smile in this way, and everyone else kind of has their own smile. You may see the differences here in the color of my suit in comparison to everyone there. It definitely looks very 1980s, I know. But my point in sharing this with you is, as a part of my family, we can all take a picture and everyone has their own story, right? My father has his own story and how he came to be and his thoughts and his beliefs. The same is true for my mother as well as my brothers. As a part of my story, I wanted to let you know that in this picture, I struggled for years seeing this picture on my family's living room wall. And one of the reasons why I struggled is because I didn't feel like I was a part of the family. They were all wearing dark suits, and here I am with a light colored suit. And it took me a while to finally ask my parents, what's up with that? Why do I have a different color on? I thought we were supposed to be united. My mother said, oh, that was your brother's hand-me-down. I didn't have enough time to go find you a suit, and so you wore one of his hand-me-downs, okay? I'm gonna connect this story throughout what we're talking about, but if I just skip along just a little bit, I remember this saying that stuck out in my head from my father for a very long time. His saying was, one day he pulled me to the side. I'm not sure what happened or what led to this, but he goes, you're so much like your mother. He goes, you trust people and you get upset when they hurt you. But I, on the other hand, I trust no one. And that way, I'm not surprised when they do something untrustworthy. And it really began to create this framework in my brain that challenged the way that I thought during that time. And as a young child, I remember thinking, wow, that kind of came out of the blue. What happened? What's wrong with the way that mom and I think? What have we been doing wrong? But as you can imagine, after that time, I began to make very intentional, um, you know, set aside intentional time to think about the way that I treated other people. And I wanted to make sure that I became more like my father because I looked up to him, that I began to form relationships where I was quiet and I was reserved and I didn't necessarily share much about myself because I wanted to make sure that I heeded my father's advice. I changed my outlook based on this one simple interaction. So I want to talk to you a little bit before we get started too deep into our discussion today about sometimes the hidden forces that may exist that we may not even be aware of. There's a relationship between what we believe and our identity. Okay, so think about that. There's a direct connection between our beliefs and our identity. So that as you're watching this video that I'm about to show, I want you to consider both the manner and the style by which you learn. I want you to consider both the manner and the style by which you learn, and how do you balance that with new information?
What causes us to make decisions in life? We think the answer is obvious. People know what's good for them. They weigh their options and make a rational decision. When a waiter in a diner asks you if you'd like to order dessert after a meal, the answer is easy. My belly isn't full, plus I love sweets equals, of course I'd like dessert. In other words, you make your own decisions. But what if there's 4 other people sitting at the table with you, and each of them already said no thank you when asked if they would like dessert? Do you change your answer? What's happened here is explained by Jonah Berger, Stanford PhD and professor of marketing at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, in his new book Invisible Influence: The Hidden Forces That Shape Behavior. In 1951, Solomon Asch set up a similar experiment, asking people which of these lines is the same as this one: A, B, or C. Even though the answer is obvious, many people answered C. How could that be? Just like at the diner, the actual subject of the test was choosing last. Before him were paid actors that gave the same wrong answer: C, C, and C. They influenced the subject to conform just as you conform to decline dessert. Nonsense, you say. That's true for others, but not for me. I am free from influence. I see through the fog of external factors to make objective and powerful decisions. But Jonah Berger shows that these influences are often so strongly embedded in our nature, they're practically impossible to resist. In fact, it is not just humans. Many animals are affected by influence, even cockroaches. In 1969, Robert Zion studied the effects of a crowd on racing cockroaches. The result? Cockroaches ran faster when being watched. How amazing is that? That's not all. The same audience made them run slower when Robert made the race more difficult. Later studies showed the same happens to humans. This means you're better off finding a private spot when you're doing something difficult and gathering around people when you're doing something easy. Jonah explains that this susceptibility to external influences isn't good or bad. If we weren't able to react subconsciously to many different situations, life would be very inefficient. But if we learn how these influences affect us, we can use them to make our lives better and that of those around us. How does the environment affect our actions? When should we follow others' influence and when should we avoid it and go the other way? You can find the answers to these questions in Jonah's new book.
All right. So let me make some connections here. Earlier on, you saw the photo of my family and I. I talked to you about this feeling that I had for quite some time about observing that I was in a different colored suit. And secondly, I talked to you about the conversation that my dad had with me about me being too trustworthy or too trusting. And so I want to connect those two things to the hidden force that existed in both occasions. The hidden force was that sometimes our thoughts, depending on how we act upon them, can carry weight much more than what we realize. They can be very influential in how we think and how we carry ourselves and the decisions we make. And so in this video, hopefully you had a chance to see, even as a part of this professional development session we're participating in, the goal should always be to encourage critical thinking so that a person is able to walk away with their own thought and their own rationale. And that rationale can be based on research, it could be based on patterns or of circumstances. But essentially, you want to be able to allow your students an opportunity to question you. You would want, I would hope, the students to associate critical thinking with sometimes disagreeing with what you share, as long as it's done in a respectful and kind way, I'm sure. And oftentimes as teachers, it's important to understand that if we really want to participate in equity work. Equity work means I am not the sage on the stage and the purveyor of all knowledge as your teacher. I may say things that may influence you. There may be some hidden forces that exist in what I say or show that I welcome you to challenge. So in classrooms, whether it's online or on ground, make sure that you create an environment where you say to them and you practice, it's okay if you challenge me. It's okay if you find an answer that's different than the answer that I found. Let's have a conversation about that. And you create that environment so that students know that as a part of true diversity, equity, and inclusion, they can approach an understanding on their own. They can own it in their own way. All right, I want to talk to you about a really important theory. If you're not familiar, Yuri Bronfenbrenner is a famous psychologist and philosopher who was really a part of helping to bring the Head Start program to the federal government and in turn to communities around the country. Bronfenbrenner talked a lot about how each person has their own microsystem in which they're a part. And for many of us, this microsystem is unique. It could be the traditional microsystem where both parents are present, or it could be a microsystem where perhaps one parent is present, or saying the parents of the similar gender identity is present. It can even be a microsystem where no parents are present. And the child is in a microsystem of perhaps grandparents or a friend or a part of foster care, for example. It's important to understand that as we continue to live in this society, our microsystems are becoming more and more diverse. In other words, students are coming into the classroom that have such a wide range of microsystems that may even change throughout their adolescence. Okay? And it doesn't necessarily reflect stability or instability. So if there is a mother and father in the microsystem, and let's say one of the parents passes away or that there's a divorce during their adolescence, it doesn't necessarily create instability just by changing the microsystem. The instability may be created by some other influences, which we'll talk about. It's important to know that this microsystem is the most influential part of a child's life. It is within their home. It is the most tangible things that they see and interact with on a day-to-day basis. But you'll see here in the example, family is a part of a microsystem. It could be a certain health service. Let's say if a child has a special need. It could be if they are a part of a church or a religious organization, their neighborhood, their friends, and so forth. The next system is called the mesosystem. Your mesosystem is really the interaction between your microsystem components. So in essence, if my microsystem is made up of my parents and my teachers and friends, my mesosystem are the interaction between parents and family, teachers and friends. Did my mom and dad go to my school events? Did my school have an open communication channel with my parents and family? And the interaction or lack of interaction between those microsystems creates your mesosystem. The third system is your exosystem. And it really is the extension of your micro and mesosystem. So, if by example, your microsystem is made up of both parents, like my family in that 1980 picture, then your exosystem would be made up of grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Let's say, for example, as a part of your microsystem, you had a sports team that you had for years as a child in your adolescence. If that's a part of your microsystem, then your exosystem may be things like going to the park where the baseball team or football team played, or the neighborhood in the gym was located for your basketball team. That may be a part of your exosystem. Essentially, it's an extension of your micro. Your parents' economic situation is another example. Whether you were of certain access to resources or money, if there was a lot of TV that influenced your childhood, maybe you were a latchkey child and you went home after school by yourself, let yourself in the house, and perhaps watch TV for the first few hours after getting out of school. That is a part of your exosystem. So it's not as influential, perhaps, but it could very well be. The next system is your macro system. And this is really a little bit less tangible than your micro, not so much people. Your macro system instead are the attitudes and ideologies of your culture. So for example, I am an African-American man from the South, I'm from Texas. And so a big part of the attitude that forms who I am today is Southern hospitality, where, if you went out to a restaurant or someone came to your home, there were certain practices that made common practice for how we treated one another. Saying yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, or yes, sir, and no, sir. Those are all a part of my macro system, or the attitudes and ideologies of my culture. Perhaps if you're from the Midwest, you have a different macro system. Or if you were a part of a certain political association growing up and politics was a big part of family discussion, then that can form your macro system attitude or ideology. It varies. The last system is the chronos system. And this is more about environmental changes that occur over the course of one's life. Now, I want to say this. The part of your chronos system, it can be something that takes place in a certain point in time, but it influences you, over a lifetime. Let me give you an example. If there is the death of a sibling that happened during your childhood, that may have influenced how your parents and family interacted with one another. That may have influenced, as a part of your chronos system, your living conditions or living situation. It may have influenced your neighborhood, your attitude and ideology, so forth and so on. Another chronos system example I want to give you is a recent one that we're all affected by, and that is COVID-19. COVID-19 is literally an environmental change that has affected the way that many businesses operate, the way that many schools operate, and it's affected individuals and their families. And so that's a second example of a chronos system effect. Essentially, we all have our own Bronfenbrenner ecological system. We all have those things that help us to become who we are. And they're not negative necessarily. They can have some negative component. But I want you to think about your Bronfenbrenner similar to ACEs, right? The adverse childhood experiences. Bronfenbrenner is a total makeup of your ecological system. I should say, Bronfenbrenner's ecological system is a total makeup of who you are. So you need to look at each component of who you are and also understand that each one of your students has their own ecological system. They have their own identity of who they are. Lastly, before we leave the slide, I think it's important to note that a child may have their own ecological system, and they may come from a home with several individuals with their own ecological system. So they're all trying to figure out how to make things work so that perhaps there are some shared macro system attitudes and values, but it's not necessarily a given that living together or being in a classroom together will automatically create the same macro system. And I bring that up is because often as teachers, we try to provide expectations, classroom rules, we give a syllabus, and we want our students to automatically abide by the expectations we provide, when essentially what they're doing is they're taking their own macro system from their micro system, and they are also using that to compare to the new expectations or attitudes that you want them to practice. And they're trying to balance all of those things out. The younger the child, the more complicated it can be for them. Okay? The older the child, the more dynamic it can be for them, and that they see the nuances sometimes that may exist. They may look at patterns and say, wait a minute, I have this one teacher that says it's totally okay if I leave the classroom without raising my hand, or if I turn in my assignments a day or two late. And you're telling me, as a part of your attitude and expectation, it's not okay for me to turn in late assignment, right? So they're trying to balance all of those things. How do you deal with that? It's essentially up to you, depending on your ecological system, right? But one of the things that I want to point out is it's not bad for you to have set expectations. It's not bad if your attitudes and ideologies happen to be different from some of your students. But it's necessary to figure out how to balance those differences, how to make sure that your set expectations and their set expectations can be balanced so that they're productive. Sometimes there are challenges within the classrooms that may exist no matter the modality. And those challenges can either be intrapersonal, interpersonal, job specific, or it could be something that's outside of the classroom and may not have as much to do with you and or your students. From an intrapersonal perspective, we are in the teaching business, and a big part of our job in education is to be relational. There are often times where we have to network our students together to put them in collaborative spaces, or perhaps we have to influence them that a particular concept is necessary for them to learn. Those are all interpersonal skills that we use. Often it's taken for granted. I know in the last few years, we have heard a lot about making sure that we have time for self-care, we have time to reflect. It really is an important thing that we sometimes take for granted. As service providers in education, who focus primarily on intrapersonal skill development, we sometimes lack opportunities for interpersonal skill development. You really should be looking at yourself and figuring out how to give the best version of yourself situation. When I was a student teacher, I remember having a older mentor teacher tell me that I need to leave my troubles at the door. When I come to the classroom door, leave my problems behind and be ready to teach. And that's how I learned as a student teacher, is to leave my problems behind. And over time, as responsibilities build and the children, your own personal life situations that pop up, it can become more complex and more difficult to do that. So it's okay to walk into a classroom sometimes and say, hey, you guys, Professor Hollis is having a little bit of a rough day. Be patient with me as we get started. It's totally okay, because I need to make sure that I respect my interpersonal development enough that there's a certain level of professional honesty that I give to my students so that we can work toward a common goal. Thirdly, job specific. We know that there are sometimes policies, there's this new initiative or process that's been handed down that we want to try to understand, or perhaps we disagree with and we don't understand, that can affect how we teach. We have to make sure, though, that we are doing the work that can sometimes help the situation by really showing the integrity in that, hey, I know that this is something I disagree with. Let me work to resolve it so that we can, make sure this policy works for us. Or there's a new initiative. Let me do some research outside of the classroom to figure out how to make this the best it can be. Those job-specific challenges can impact classroom practice, so it's really important that we pay attention to that. And then last but not least, we talked about this loosely, but sometimes there are some work-to-life balance issues that can impede upon instructional practice. We have them, our students have them, our colleagues may have them. And so we really have to make sure that we're aware of those challenges that exist, that we address them head on so that we can make sure that we are giving honor to students' ecological system. All right, well, we have another very brief video that I want you to watch for just a second. This brief video is really another one about the relationship between your own beliefs and your personal identity. But look, as you're watching this, I want you to consider just kind of how you think or rethink. That's an important word. I want you to consider how you think and rethink. And what I mean by rethink is, how do you do when there is something that you've believed this whole time that you now find new data or new information that challenges that belief? How do you do in that space? If you remember earlier in the conversation, we were talking about being open to students challenging you. So in the instance of rethinking, if you've done something like a math process a certain way, for example, and there's now a student who challenges your way of thinking, how do you honor that? Okay, so we're just going to look at this for a second. I'm actually going to, I think I have the video here.
The way that I've landed at thinking about this is to say, look, when you have a belief, you have two options. One is you can subject it to a rethinking cycle. The other is you can fall victim to an overconfidence cycle. So an overconfidence cycle is, something we've all both committed and witnessed probably too many times. But the basic idea is we start by being proud of something that we think we know. And that leads us then to feel a lot of conviction. That kind of launches us into confirmation bias, where we look for information that confirms our expectations, as well as desirability bias, where we look for information that basically reinforces what we want to be true. And then we see what we expected to see and what we wanted to see, and we get validated, and that only makes us prouder of what we know and less open to rethinking. The rethinking cycle is very much the opposite. It starts for me with intellectual humility, which is about knowing what you don't know. So no matter how much of an expert you are in a given field or a given topic, you have a long list of things that you're clueless about. And being aware of what your ignorance is leads you to doubt your convictions. It makes you curious about what you don't know, and that opens your mind to new discoveries. And then every time you learn something new, it's not this sign that, oh, now I'm an expert. It's this sense that, well, there's so much more to learn, right? And I've made a tiny, tiny dot of progress in, a whole universe of knowledge. And I can't wait to see what I learn next.
All right. So sorry about that. I'm going to go back through, because a big part of how I'd like to end this conversation and this session is by really having us understand that we have an opportunity all the time to make ourselves vulnerable with our students, to demonstrate true diversity, equity, and inclusion, which means we are ever evolving people. And I think there's grace in your students knowing that you as a teacher, you may know a lot of things in a particular content area or cross content areas that you are responsible for sharing with them. It's the responsibility that you have to enlighten. As a part of enlightenment, the students in turn have a responsibility of taking the information you share, managing that information so that they contribute to the learning process as well. And I say all that to say, it can be really vulnerable for many of us. I've been there, I'm there often, where I struggle with what I know and the confidence that I have in knowing it. And I balance that with the struggle of, how open am I to learning even more? Case in point, one of the courses I most often teach at Grand Canyon University is on social justice. And in the last few years of social justice with COVID-19 and the global pandemic, and with the need for more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace and other institutions, I am challenged with what that means more and more for individuals. As we talk about religion or gender identity, sexual preference, as we talk about race, ethnicity, there are so many different nuances that I've only yet to hear about after years of teaching this information. Why? Because we're ever evolving. And people sometimes have new experiences that they bring to the table that lend to a new aspect of the conversation. So, as we close, please think about evolving your worldview in a way that honors what you already know to be true with a delicate balance of being open to rethinking about things based on new information gained. Okay? I want to encourage you to look more for the free professional development sessions available through Grand Canyon University K-12 Educational Development. You can subscribe to the channel. You can also utilize the free resources available via the QR code. We have professional development sessions on demand. They are low cost, they're individualized to institutions as they communicate a need, and we call them solutions to go. Feel free to take the information and use it as your organization needs. And then lastly, I'm going to share references used today, including Bronfenbrenner, should you choose to use it, as well as some other ones to create PowerPoint. Thank you, folks. And hopefully you enjoyed the session. And again, hopefully you use this information to share with others. Please feel free to contact me should you need. Thank you.